We're excited to welcome Professor Dr. Stephanie Fehr, Ralf Kamphöner, and Markus Sulzer to the stage as our next speakers. Stephanie took over the Professorship for Compliance, Data Protection and Corporate Auditing at the Ansbach University of Applied Science and has also held a teaching position in the field of corporate compliance at the University of Kassel since 2018. She's a business lawyer and has gained extensive experience in professional whistleblower and ethics management in senior compliance functions in DAX companies. Ralf Kamphöner heads the Confederation of the German Textile and Fashion Industries EU Office and Trade Department. Until 2017, he served as director with Eurocommerce, inter alia on trade. He's a strong supporter of the WTO and built international alliances for the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. In 2013, he was appointed vice chair of the European Services Forum. Markus Sulzer is member of the Executive Board and Chief Revenue Officer at EQS Group and is responsible for global revenues and marketing. He joined the company in 2007 and has played a leading role in its international expansion. Markus studied economics and holds an MBA.
Yeah, dear ECEC community, welcome to this panel. I'm very, very delighted to be joined by Stephanie and Ralf, a panel about supply chain and a panel which is combining basically science, politics, and practice. And I'm very, very thankful that Stephanie is here and will introduce the study results which we did together. We did a lot of science practice studies already. We did the whistleblowing survey for many times, and now the first one, the biggest one, about supply chain. Stephanie, glad that you're here, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Markus, and thank you for the opportunity to present all this information about the learnings of the EQS supply chain survey. Before we start digging deeper into the results of the survey, I would like to introduce you to the Big Five. Not the Big Five of a safari, so no worries about that, but the Big Five of the mandatory sustainability governance. So first of all, if you take a look at the left side, you see the elephant. So the elephant in the Big Five of sustainability governance stands for the CRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I guess most of you are familiar with this one, as well as the taxonomy regulations, but I'm not sure if all of you have heard about the Supply Chain Act, because the Supply Chain Act is just a German law and is more or less the basis for the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, so short CSDDD. And therefore, it makes sense to take a deeper look into what's going on up here in Germany to get any kind of impact for European countries when the CSDDD will be enforced one day. So what's the German supply chain all about? So the German supply chain is all about that it affects companies with 3,000 employees. So for the time being, around 700 companies are affected by the Supply Chain Act. And at the beginning of the upcoming year, the figure or the number will drop down. So companies with 1,000 employees will be also affected by the supply chain law. So what kind of obligations do German companies have right now? They have the obligation to set up a management system to observe human rights and environmental standards. So they do not only need to do it with regard to their own businesses, they also need to do it with regard to their direct suppliers and the entire supply chain. I guess you could imagine it's a really huge burden. And to name a few things, what they need to do is to have a risk analysis in place, not only with regard to their business, also with regard to direct suppliers and the whole supply chain. They also need to implement a whistleblowing system and report to the Federal Ministry of Economy, Affairs and Trade about what they are doing right now. And if they don't do something like this, you could assume, as always, there are fines in place, and at the moment it could be up to 8 million euros or 2% of the global annual sales. So a really huge impact has this German law. So therefore, it was quite important to dig deeper in what's going on up here in Germany right now, and how did we do the survey at all. So we had two different kinds of steps. So the first step was just we did a kind of looking at what are the existing surveys, and honestly, there hadn't been so much surveys in place because the law is quite new. And due to these results, we built up a kind of an online questionnaires, and about 470 participants took place in the online questionnaire. And after we did a closer look at those results, we run a kind of expert interviews. I guess all of you could imagine that expert interviews are quite important for research studies to dig deeper into a topic, because sometimes you see for sure certain kind of figures and what they may kind of impact they have, but if you talk to people, you get a different kind of feeling. So therefore, it was really good to have those expert interviews as an additional option. So who participated in the survey? In the survey participated all in with, together with the expert interviews around 500 people from different industries and services. As you see, we have got mainly the average of German industries up here, like IT and services, production sites, also automotive, healthcare, banks, energy, and so on and so on. So it's was quite good to have all them in place. And besides this, around 55% of the participants are affected by the German supply chain law. So 35% are affected right now, and about more than 20% are affected as of 1st of January this year. So why did we also take into consideration those other companies? We took them into consideration because it's quite important to learn about the impact for those companies. Even if the law does not affect them directly, there is a kind of an indirect effect on those ones. Besides this, I guess it's not a big surprise. Companies from Europe mainly participated, but also participated companies from Americas and China, who have got a German subsidiary here in Germany, because they are also affected by the law. So we have got a broad range of people and companies who took place in the study. What are the key findings of the research study? So the key findings of all is that 94% of the companies perceive the German Supply Chain Act as an additional burden with a high level of bureaucracy. What does that mean? I guess you all could imagine that companies have to struggle with a lot of crises right now. For instance, the energy crisis, the wars in Ukraine, Israel, and they do not have enough people to manage all these obligations by the German supply chain. They do not have the financial support and do not have all those systems and services in place to manage all those requirements. On the other hand, they have the feeling of they cannot change the world. So they told me, so we crunching a lot of papers and figures, but we cannot change the world with regard to human rights and environmental standards somewhere else in the world. So honestly, there was this really strong negative feeling during the whole research study about this German law which is in place right now. How does people implement the requirements of the German Supply Chain Act? So first of all, they set up a project team. This project team was mainly led by compliance and procurement people, and they have run a kind of a gap analysis. So what is a gap analysis? So they try to take a look at what are the requirements by law, identified the existing structures and services, and try to close the gap. So most companies try to close the gap by using the compliance management system and adopt the human rights environmental standards by the German Supply Chain Act just within those existing structures. But and honestly, for those of them, it had been also a quite huge burden to integrate all those obligations. But for those ones who do not have a management system like a compliance management system, it was really hard. They had really to struggle, and they're still struggling with all those things. Additionally, they are struggling with the uncertainty of certain kind of requirements. So for sure, the Federal Ministry of Economy Affairs and Trade have published a lot of information and guidelines on how to apply the German Supply Chain Act. But people say, so sorry, cannot transfer those information into our business, especially if you think of a certain kind of term with regard to the risk analysis. So the German law tells you you need to run a risk analysis with regard to your suppliers if they have an impact to the product or services which you are offering to your customer. And would you imagine right now you are a production company, have a production site in Germany, and you have got a cleaning company for sure who's cleaning your production site. Are those ones the one which you need to take into account for a risk analysis or not? So that's one of those really huge points companies are struggling right now. Additionally, under the German supply chain law, you need to have a place a human rights officer or someone who's responsible for the obligations regarding the law. We have seen that 66.2% have not appointed a human rights officer yet. What is the reason for that? Reason is that you have a lot of liabilities when you're taking over this position, but honestly, you do not have enough rights to handle all those, the negative side as the liabilities. And therefore, a lot of people, especially compliance people, said, sorry, I don't want to take over this position. And that's why a lot of companies do not have appointed someone yet. Additionally, we have seen that there's also a kind of a trickle-down effect. So companies try to investigate their whole supply chain to get information on who is our supplier, and the supplier, to run certain kind of risk analysis and to get a clue on what's going on up there, but they didn't get all this information from their supplier. So therefore, their idea was just to pass on the obligations of the German Supply Chain Act via contract obligations. So for sure, the Federal Ministry of Economy, Affairs and Trade said, sorry, that's not the right way to handle all the requirements by the law. You are not allowed to pass on all your obligations to someone else who is not obliged by law to handle those things. But companies telling us right now that's the only option what we can do to run good kind of risk analysis to mitigate certain kind of risks and to handle all those respecting issues. Last point, but not least point, is the point about the effectiveness review of the decree of implementation. So what's that about? It's about that under the German supply chain law, you need to run a kind of an effectiveness review, like a kind of an audit to see, do we have implement all our obligations in the kind of the right way, to put it that way. But companies should do it once in a year. But right now, 86% told us, sorry, we cannot do that right now. So, and if they would have a wish for to the company, it would be good if this point could be postponed for the upcoming years, because they are so much struggling right now with the implementation processes and to put all those requirements in the right way. So, and what does that all mean for the upcoming EU rights due diligence legislation, so especially the CSDDD? Companies say, sorry, if there will be the CSDDD in place one day, we do not have all those resources to handle all those things. It's not only the resources, what we are talking about, it's also kind of missing kind of digitalization. So even big companies have told during the research study that they for sure know their direct suppliers and they have the master data in the SAP system with regard to their suppliers. But if it comes to terms of risk analysis, what do? They just download those information into an Excel sheet. And I guess you could imagine how difficult it is to run a risk analysis via Excel. So totally strange. And as long as there's no much increase of digitalization options, for sure it would be difficult to stick to an upcoming law like a CSDDD. Besides this, we have seen there's also a kind of a lack of knowledge of the supply chain. So a lot of companies try to investigate on who's our supplier, but in most cases, if they ask their direct suppliers, what is your supply chain? They said, sorry, I don't want to tell you all those details. Or they said, sorry, we don't know about our supply chain in detail as well. And therefore, as long as there is no grip or clue about what's going on in the supply chain, I guess it's also difficult to implement those requirements with regard to the CSDDD at all. So just one wish for the upcoming law, it would be really good if there's something like suppliers need to work together with their customers with regard on supply chain to get any kind of knowledge about what's going on. Besides this, we have seen in the survey as well that there's a lack of understanding with regard to the European or the German supply chain requirements in total. So if you talk to companies in America or China, they say, okay, there's another upcoming law for Europe which doesn't change the world at all. It's just about paper crunching. And so therefore, especially European countries see a kind of negative impact of the competitiveness if the CSDDD will come into effect as it should be right now. But I guess, Ralf, you can tell us much more about the upcoming legislation process and what are the details right now, what's going on up there. So I would like to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for the insights of the survey. And yeah, I agree. Companies seem to be annoyed. They don't seem to be ready.
Yeah.
And the politics is continuing to putting pressure on companies. So Ralf, glad that you joined from Brussels. And we are very, very excited to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Greetings from Brussels. Nice sunny day here. Let's dig into the details of what we call CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is currently in elaboration and which many companies in the sector I represent here in Brussels feel it may make things even worse than they have become through the German Supply Chain Act. But one thing after the other. On the first slide that I've prepared for you, you see the timeline. And when you see where it started from a situation actually where in the 27 EU member states, we had completely different legal situations. Some states had national regulation in place, others didn't. And then under the German presidency, the proposal came on the table to have also CSDDD at European level, to have a level playing field EU-wide. And you see here some players who contributed to all that discussion. Commissioners within the European Commission, different departments, not all of them in agreement. The same goes for the European Parliament, who has now played a role to push for CSDDD, but there were also people in the European Parliament who said, well, that's not that much of a good idea. So the full range of democratic opinions of exchange came into being before finally in February 22, the Commission put its proposal on the table. And now if you are a company and you ask me, what should I start implementing and when? The answer is the process is still ongoing and the European Commission is still discussing in a trial procedure with the European Parliament and with the 27 member states what will finally remain out of what the Commission put on the table. So what I can tell you now is that it's in the process of being made, and there's a little question mark even whether at all the whole thing will be adopted before the European Parliament will enter into its next elections foreseen for June 2024. But let's do one step after the other, go to the next slide, and discover what the European Commission has put on the table. I take you in a few minutes through the key points of the proposal. The proposal is going beyond the scope of the German Supply Chain Act. If you look at which companies are concerned, we're talking about companies under EU law with more than 500 employees and with more than 150 million euro per annum net turnover. For small and medium-sized companies, the so-called SMEs, there are limits. that start at 250 employees and more than 40 million euro per net turnover, per annum net turnover, if at least 50% of the production is obtained, for instance, in textiles, clothing, footwear, leather. So that is what the Commission had in mind. And for companies under non-EU law, the same thresholds should apply regarding the parts of their business, the part of their turnover generated in the European Union. So that's in a nutshell the companies which are concerned, and what the European legislator expects from those companies is to abide by obligations in the field of human rights, where 22 international conventions are referred to, and 11 bans in international conventions pertaining to the protection of the environment. And the scope of responsibility includes not liability for the entire chain, so you're not held responsible for each and every remote actor in the chain, but there's no limitation either to the next partner company in the supply chain, commonly referred to here in Brussels as tier -1. So it's not limited to what a company can reasonably oversee. And the scope of responsibility is then extended to the own activities and activities by subsidiaries. What exactly that means is still under discussion. Let's go to the next slide to see the company obligations. Company obligations relating to the possible negative impact on environment or human rights. And the expectation is that they should undertake measures to prevent or to mitigate damages. For instance, investment in production and infrastructure, action plans with fixed deadlines and indicators, and also freezing some of their business relationships. The liability is spelled out under civil law for damages caused by violation of due diligence obligations, and complaints at courts in the European Union should also be possible. Exceptions are foreseen, at least according to what the Commission proposes, for damages caused by indirect business partners under certain conditions, if an EU company has taken due precautions to prevent, mitigate, or to end the negative impact, and there are contractual guarantees laid down by business partners to respect the EU code of conduct. So that's also an exception foreseen by the European Commission. Criminal law responsibility is not foreseen. And to implement all those obligations, there's a role foreseen for the state and for the companies as well. For the state, the obligation would be to establish an EU surveillance authority network and sanctions, for instance, fines under the national laws. For the companies, there would be the mandatory establishment of a complaint mechanism for injured persons, trade unions, and other representatives of employees and civil society organizations. So you see, it's quite far-reaching. Let's go to the next slide, where I have noted some of the controversial points currently under discussions. There are some more. There's a lot of nitty-gritty discussions, as you can imagine, when the Parliament is involved, the member states. But here you see question marks behind human rights, environment, the question, should there be more dimensions covered? And then the question, how to deal with small and medium-sized companies, how to exempt them from the scope, given that obviously in the chain everything is linked together, and if a small company is linked by a contract to a large company, of course the large company involves in one way or the other the smaller company in the responsibilities. So the question is also, how far should the liability in the chain reach? Should it be the next partner in the chain, so the business partner, the company knows and can have an opinion on, or should it include also further remote part of the chain? And something that was requested by some of the European Parliament, they wanted to foresee especially strict treatment for some individual sectors. Whether that will come or not is also under discussion. We have been pushing for a safe harbor sort of clause that would mean that when you as a company have done a certain amount of action precautions, then you should be exempt from responsibility, as is the case, for instance, in the export control law in the European Union. And voilà, that is what is under discussion. And as I said before, the trilogue between the three big European institutions is ongoing. And once those three will have reached a compromise, there will be a need to transpose all that into national law, for instance, in German national law. And for that, Germany and the 26 other EU member countries will have 2 years time. Now, let's go to the next slide with some general comments from the industry. And when I say the industry, of course, I refer to the sector I represent here in Brussels, the German textile and fashion industry. Let me first say that the sector is already committed to fair social and environmental standards along the supply chains, and the companies are undertaking tremendous efforts already to constantly expand knowledge and control. And it's also a sector that that does all that despite the fact that we live in times of crisis. Just to recall COVID, the upheavals we have in the field of foreign policy, all the things that we are experiencing now with energy prices. So that puts a heavy strain on economic development in Europe, in particular on small and medium-sized companies who would definitely expect that policymakers spare them additional burdens from additional regulatory requirements. Now, let me say one more thing on this slide, which you see as the last big bullet point. What is the likely impact of CSDDD on import diversification, which is a declared aim of sustainable trade policies pursued also by the European Union? You probably should see that from the point of view of an SME importing from abroad, from outside the European Union. And that company under CSDDD will, of course, seek to minimize the risk that it runs by importing. So what will the company likely do? The company will say, oh, I reduce my number of suppliers, I import from a smaller number of companies, from a smaller number of countries. So what remains is the links with the big countries, the big suppliers, and small developing countries and SMEs in those countries would probably be on the flip side of the coin and be pretty much disadvantaged. That was at least the finding of EW Cologne, a research institute, economic research institute that is very renowned in Germany. But let's go to the next slide with some of the points that we were mentioning
Ralph?
In our position papers when we commented on the plans on the table.
Ralph,
of course, it's better to... Yes.
Can you hear me, Ralph? Great. I'm just forced to push us into a bit speed up towards the end of the session. That would be great. I'm already scared of what you shared.
That is no problem. I was foreseeing that anyway. First, it's better to have legislation at EU level than at national level, but a plurilateral initiative would have been much better. We expect too much disproportionate regulatory complexity. It would have been much better to cut red tape. And all that, of course, what we have on the table came into being because some policymakers have a somewhat distorted image of our industry. And the point on SME is a very key point that you hear very often these days, because simply they have fewer human resources than large trading companies, and some more thoughts should have been given to them. On the next slides, you see that we call for moderation and balance. It's very important to maintain that, to keep it all manageable, to really limit deregulation to tier -1, to limit sanctions to intentional and grossly negligent violations, to exclude civil liability, and to keep the bureaucratic burden to the absolute minimum. And of course, it's also important to avoid double structures of requirements for company directors. On my last slide, to which we switch now, there is a point that we made on complaint mechanisms that need to be unbureaucratic. and need to offer sufficient protection against abuse. Then sanctions must be defined with legal clarity. I talked earlier about the need for safe harbor provisions. Then if you implement a thing like CSDDD, you need sufficiently long transition periods. We go for 5 years. And as you would expect, accompanying measures to support businesses are also needed. That's all I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ralph. It didn't make our afternoon better with all this uncertainty in the regulation, but I think this is what will happen, and we need to get ready. And the last comment to the audience, I mean, when we speak to a large number of customers over the past months, we see exactly what we have learned in the studies and what we have heard. There is a lot of anger, companies being afraid of time and resources to be invested. They don't have the people to do that. But they see also positive things. And I mean, there are positive things. Getting transparency into supply chains, reducing risk by this. Environmental protection, human rights protection as a business advantage, actually. And ultimately, creating trusted companies. This is what we are all here for. So let's look at the positives and deal with all the challenges ahead. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you so much, Ralph. And yeah, see you very soon.